Spirituality, I want to start with a couple of stories. A couple of weeks ago, probably a month ago, my best friend and I decided to go for a walk. It was a beautiful day. And we were walking towards the Fox River, which is, I don't know, less than a mile from my house. And there's a park about a block from my house that we have to cut through to get there. And in the park that particular day, they were having a pagan music festival. And there were all these tents set up, and you could hear some music coming out of the pavilion, the big pavilion there. And we were walking through it. My buddy, he's Unitarian Universalist, and he loves music. We're very, very compatible. And I said to him, I'm like, well, do you want to stop and listen to some of the music for a little bit? And he kind of looked over, and I had said, it's a pagan music festival. And he said, I don't get it. I don't get paganism at all. I don't get why I'd want to go listen to the music at all. And I kind of said, oh, okay. And it quickly flashed me back. Now, we didn't pursue it. I didn't really ask him why he said that. We wandered off to the rest of our walk. But immediately I was flashed back to a dinner party about 20 years ago where a friend of mine said that they were going to a wedding soon, and the woman in the relationship is a male-female relationship, that she had decided to convert to Judaism because her spouse was Jewish. And this friend of mine said, why would any Christian do that? Because it's like going backwards. And I thought, oh my. And then I was also drawn back to my own feelings when I discovered Unitarian Universalism, because I came from a very fundamentalist Lutheran perspective, and was very happy so, without question. And then somewhere, as it always happens, when I was about 19, kind of began to question that and went through a whole series of redefining what my theology was. First liberal Christianity, and then when we moved to Appleton 25 years ago, discovered the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship there, and that set me on another journey. And I do remember when I finally got my head wrapped around it and accepted that I was not going to be exclusively Christian anymore, that I also thought of it as, well, now I've found the true evolution of religion, and Unitarian Universalism is really where it's at, and so now I can discard everything before that, including everything I came from. So all of that is not the case, and that's really what I wanted to talk about today, is in what I've come, and it took until, frankly, seminary, for me to get my head wrapped around how is Unitarian Universalism able to be all these things all at the same time? How does it make sense? And so what I'll describe is really my journey, and for me, and I know that's going to be different for all of you, as it always is in Unitarian Universalism. But for me, it's the magic of religious metaphor. That is, if I was able to step back and think, well, at the end of the day, if I believe that religion is a very human phenomenon, and it's all about humans trying to make sense of their universe and trying to find meaning and what's after this and why am I here, we are very relational creatures. We are very quick to anthropomorphize everything, including my dog. You know, I think my dog is smiling at me. It probably just had gas, right? You know, we're quick to do those kinds of things. So of course, when you're trying to make sense of things, you're probably going to think of mountains as people, or, you know, the planets as some sort of a people and that kind of thing. And it's all good, because I think religious metaphor is very useful, and it speaks to us today. And so we should be able to hang on to those when it feels meaningful to you. So let me give you a couple of, remind you of a couple of things. First of all, we have 6 sources. We talk about the 7 principles. We actually have 6 sources that we don't mention very often. And the very first source, and this is a quote from the UUA website, is direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. So I always, when I was teaching this in Unitarian Universalism 101 classes, I said, okay, that first source is basically the transcendentalists in the mid-19th century that felt moved by just nature and the belief that humans, nature, and God were all one, and it was our purpose in life to get it all back together again. But then, as I reread it again recently, I'm like, no, it's way more beyond just the transcendentalists. this is talking about that transcending mystery and wonder, which is affirmed in all cultures. And so to me, that gets into the core of it, that it's very intuitive. You don't have to go study in seminary to figure out what your theology is. It's very emotional. It can be very ecstatic. You can just feel your emotions. I don't know about you, but when I'm in the mountains and I'm sitting there on a cliff looking over everything, or the Grand Canyon, I can't but get ecstatic about it. And then that becomes a very spiritual experience when I'm looking at that. And I can't explain it. And I'm sure those of you that are out in nature a lot as well have had similar experiences. You can't explain it. And then there's our sixth source, the last one, that specifically says it's the spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. So in my mind, this comes from the historical traditions of all the world religions and what wisdom spoke to them or speaks to them yet today. And frankly, that's just one way to name that first source. It was just very more specific rather than being just generally transcendent, to say there's a whole bunch of earth-based religions that were here since the beginning of humanity on this planet that we should look to for wisdom. And that's why I wanted to do something with the medicine wheel today. So it's not incompatible with Unitarian Universalism. And I am fortunate because I come from a pretty large congregation in Appleton. It's about 750 members. And then I was in seminary and got exposed to a ton of other Unitarian Universalists. And so I have examples that are Unitarian Universalists but are also all of these. So I have a good friend who very much believes in the goddess, and that's the metaphor that she chooses to use, and to think of the goddess trying to speak to her, especially when she's really troubled and in turmoil. And just recently we were talking with each other, and she said, I'm trying to come up with a new spiritual way to really get grounded. And what I've decided to do is to spend some time, quiet time, in my meditation as in the child's pose. So any of you that are into yoga, so if you're not, let me explain that. The child's pose is basically you're down on your knees, crouched down. It's like a fetal position, but you're down towards the earth, and then you put your hands out in front of you. And I would demonstrate it, but I probably couldn't get back up right now because I haven't stretched out. Did you want to?
Well, I can do it.
No, that's okay. We don't have to yoga teacher. All right, quickly. There we go. There you go. It's the resting pose in yoga. When they first told me that, I'm like, yeah, right. But actually, it's true. So what she has decided to do, she goes, I'm going to be in the child's pose and think of myself in the lap of the goddess. And she just sees that as very protective and very energizing and very nurturing. And so it's the metaphor that she conjures up. She's a seminary student preparing for to be an ordained minister. Then there's another friend of mine in the congregation in Appleton who his thing is all about reincarnation. And he has had visions of being, I'm not going to be, I don't remember the particulars, but he's in the court of some Egyptian king, and he's like one of the scribes or something like that in this court, and he very much resonates with ancient Egyptian religion and the religious symbols and the icons that come out of that. And he absolutely believes that he's lived before and finds great reassurance in that fact. It's fascinating. I have two friends that are members of the Appleton congregation that are very much into earth-based spirituality. One of them is into Druidism, and I'll talk about her in a minute. And then Deborah Morningstar, I don't know if you have had her down here. She's a member of the Oneida tribe, and she is a great native Oneida storyteller. And so I've had her speak at several services. She's fantastic. But they're Unitarian Universalists, so they very much bridge between those two, and that natural spirituality is part of what they do. And then finally, I have a couple of friends who, before they retired, were college professors, and they were biologists and scientists. And so they are mystical in the way they think about it. So I would describe it as they're celebrating the wonders of creation discovered through science. And the way they talk about the way the world works from a scientific perspective is just mystical. And so I just didn't want to leave that out as well. It doesn't have to be the ancient religions. So the natural spirituality retreat that we had, I want to kind of walk you through it and give you a sense of what we did. Because we tend to personify the world around us and anthropomorphize it, I started with Margot Adler. Now, just a show of hands, any of you know who Margot Adler is or was? Okay, that's cool. Margot Adler was a National Public Radio correspondent for New York City, essentially. So frankly, if you listen to National Public Radio, you would probably recognize her voice. She always did these really unique stories about life in Manhattan in particular. Margot Adler was also a Unitarian Universalist and was a priestess in Wicca, and very much believed in the goddess. In fact, in 1979, on Halloween, she published a book called Drawing Down the Moon, and it, as well as another book published exactly on the same day by Starhawk, became the two, basically the two Bibles, if I can use that word, for Wicca spirituality in the United States, if not the world. And it was fascinating because Starhawk was from the West Coast, and hers was more about the ceremonies and the rituals and all that kind of stuff, a lot of the magic, if you will. And Margot Adler comes from an intellectual Jewish atheist Marxist background, and so hers was very kind of heady and intellectual. But the two of them didn't know it, but were publishing at the same day at the same time. And then she updated a few times. The reason I know all of this is I took a class from her in seminary. I was honored to do that. She died of cancer about 5 years ago, and it was a great loss. So we spent a weekend talking about paganism, and particularly the rituals in paganism. And her story is fascinating because she grew up quite privileged in Manhattan and was able to go what we would probably call today a charter school. So it was a school, maybe sort of a Montessori school style, where when they learned lessons, the kids got to act them out. So they were learning history and culture, and they would create their own skits and dress up and do this. And she said when they were 12, when she was 12, they were talking about Greek culture and the Greek divinities. And she said something just clicked for me. I was so into the Greek goddesses. I not only just wanted to learn everything I could about them, I wanted to be them. And so I started creating my own goddesses, and I started creating my own religion and acting it out. And so it very much started her on this path towards a spirituality that took these feelings she had for the mysteries of life and then was very comfortable. She goes, she's a ritual junkie. So she loved ritual, and she loved the anthropomorphization of nature. And she said she was on a mission to find a religion that would help with her strong environmentalism. And so that's how she came to Wicca, and just talked about it like she was, you know, just everyday things. And so to me, that was just astounding to have somebody standing in front of me who's that big of a figure in Wicca, coming from my Missouri Synod Lutheran background. I'm like, whoa, it's pretty cool. So what I did on the retreat is I had everybody had gone out into the prairie and the woods and chosen their spot, and they had their clipboards and their coloring things, and they had to come up with their god or goddess, their divinity that they were going to see. So personify whatever they were seeing and bring it back and share it. So it's a really cool way to get your head wrapped around what is a different way to think of religion other than just being completely intellectual about it. Then we moved on to things that are more, in my sense, earth-based and more concrete, more tangible, mostly because they're centered around rocks, in my opinion. So we watched a video on Druidism and modern-day Druidism, particularly in the British Isles, but it's also strong in pockets in North America and Australia and South Africa, essentially the former British colonies, and really talked about how Druidism was an oral tradition, so we don't have a lot of their own writings or works. It was only what the Romans, when they discovered Druids in Great Britain, or the British Isles, in what they wrote about them. And so then modern Druidism is basically a religion that tries to get in touch once again with the seasons, the cycle of the seasons, and the landscape around them. And so we learned about that. I don't want to go into it in depth because you have a speaker, a friend of mine, Heather Wesley, is coming October 16th-ish, the second Sunday, the middle of October. And she's going to do Druidism 101. And she has been Unitarian Universalist probably for 20 years, as long as I've known her, but she is so cool, and she will talk about Druidism. She'll probably wear a robe, and she'll probably do something for you. What I love most about her, she's named every tree in her yard and thinks of them as living creatures, and it's just fantastic. She's so sweet. So come that Sunday for sure for Heather. And then native spirituality. So you saw what we did. We watched a video where she described this whole medicine wheel, and then went out and created it, and then this friend of mine decided to do all these movements. So that was our way to get in touch with some of those more, I'll call them the stone-based spiritualities. And then we've ended the day with Michael Dowd. So I have to tell you, when I first came up with the description for this service, some of you know that Michael Dowd visited Appleton about a month ago, and he spoke for, what, an hour or something like that? Can you raise your hand if you were there? I was so impressed. It was like 15 of you. It took up a whole row. It was pretty cool. If you remember, he talks at a rapid-fire pace, and his concepts, I mean, it would take me 10 minutes to unpack like one sentence, and he'd be on to 5 more by the time I caught up. So my daughter actually bought his book, and it's signed by him. So I started reading it. I'm like, this sucker is dense. And there's no way I could possibly just brush over this today. So I've decided that this needs to be part of a sermon in the future. Maybe when it gets closer to Earth Day or something like that, I'll figure out how to fit it in. So today, I just wanted to touch on a couple of key concepts that he had that I thought tied in with what we were talking about. So two key concepts that he said. And there's a TED Talk out there that I would recommend you go and see, because it was magical. One of the things he talks about is that his key point is religion is a collaborative human endeavor to explain and find meaning from the environment within which we exist. And in the TED Talk, he pulls up this chart, and he has all the Greek gods and goddesses listed. So it kind of came full circle for what I wanted to do, starting with Margot Adler. And he thinks of it as religion in different phases. And so evolution, because of, I'll explain it, evolution is perfectly compatible with the way religion has been explored through the ages. So his first is religion 1.0. So way back in the early days, when humans had language, or a way to communicate with each other, you had the wisdom of the elders. And so this typically tended to be a specific person, usually someone older in the tribe or the community, who had the time and space or something experience to have some insight into how the world worked, insight into how they felt the spirits were talking to them, and they would pass on these insights in the form of stories orally, and it got handed down for generations and generations for thousands of years. So that was religion 1.0. So it was very specific to a few elders in the tribe or community, and obviously wasn't written down, so it could be changed from generation to generation. Then you got religion 2.0, and this was the wisdom of the book. And so then these stories and insights that were deemed worthy and truthful were collected. So it could have been on a cave wall. It's really the wisdom of writing, that you could write it down, and so then it would be passed on from generation to generation without having to rely on oral recitation of it. And in our space, and particularly when we got to Christianity, I think, and that's the culture, the dominant culture within which we live, there was a bunch of elders that got together and decided what they thought was most worthy and most truthful, and they canonized it and collected it sort of in a written form and said, okay, that's what we're going to all believe in collectively. So it was fine. It was a way to, if you think about it, it went from a very narrow, small group of people. And when you get to these written forms, now you could expand it. So now you had whole, what became eventually nation states or cultures could have the common format, the common books, the common writings that we all agreed we're going to use as the basis of our faith. But it was still a collaborative effort. And now he says there's religion 3.0. And 3.0 is the wisdom of science. And he calls it, it's a worldwide collaboration of scientists and the collection of things that they believe to be true, and then they're sent out in the information age for everyone to ponder, and everyone has, or most people have access to it. So his point is that nothing's really changed except the scope. And so now we're still, the way we think about religious topics, or what's really meaningful in life, why are we here, how do we get here, what's after we die. Now we have scientists that are trained and use scientific method to really think about this stuff, and we have a collaborative way that we publish it to the whole world, and so it's become sort of, in his mind, what is going to become a global religion. And so it's not that we're worshiping science, and he said that he believes that there's a lot of room for the mystical elements that we've had in the past, and to respect those, and that they're compatible with science and evolution and how he thinks it's going on. So what his second key point, when he talks about evolution, and he gets really into climate change. He is a prophet of doom and gloom of climate change, although he actually has a positive spin on it, and that's what I'll reserve for a different sermon on a different day. But when he talks, he often says, well, God or reality or God. He sees them as the same thing. He says that human beings have always used the concept of a God, of something to inform them of what's meaningful and right. And he said, well, frankly, even in the past, it was people looking around at their reality and naming it God and saying that that's what's going on and that's how we should interpret it. So he says it's the same thing, that God and reality are the same thing, and that evolution is God's message. And it's what we should be learning about that is what is sacred. So those are a high-level jump into natural spirituality, and I really wanted to say the point of my sermon today is give you permission to reclaim or explore your natural spirituality. Do it in a way that, like all my friendly volunteers up here that got you out of your comfort zone, and let your inner child speak and connect you once again to the magic of metaphor. And I shall also say that I think there's probably a lot of things in this talk that was very quick and a lot of stuff that you probably want to talk about. And so at 11:20, I'll come back up here, and if any of you want to come back, and we can talk about it a little bit more. So thank you. And from that, I believe we go into our closing hymn.